The White Mingo, the secret history of the man who couldn't be killed, the bloody ground, and the boy who vanished. The year 1756 was not merely the middle of the 18th century, it was the midnight of the American frontier. The French and Indian War, known globally as the 7 Years' War, had transformed the Appalachian Mountains and the Ohio River Valley into a continental slaughterhouse. This was a war fought not for principles of democracy or freedom, but for land, fur, and the right to exist. In this crucible, on the banks of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, lived a family of Scots-Irish settlers named the Girtys. They were rough, ambitious, and utterly unremarkable, until a spring rage shattered their lives and wrote a new, terrifying chapter into American history. It began with a Shawnee war party, silent as moss in the pre-dawn gloom. The attack was swift, brutal, and characteristic of the asymmetrical warfare gripping the colonies. When the smoke cleared, the Girty patriarch was dead, scalped in his own yard. His wife and 3 young sons were gone.
The fate of a captured settler was usually swift death or a life of grueling servitude. But the Girty boys were different. Their youth, their resilience, and perhaps a strange, raw magnetism caught the eye of their captors. The mother was eventually ransomed back to the colonies, but the boys, Simon, James, and George, were absorbed. They were scattered across the Ohio Valley, each placed into a different tribe as a replacement for a fallen warrior. This was a common yet profoundly transformative practice, a method not of slavery, but of adoption and recreation. Simon, the eldest, was taken in by the Seneca, a powerful nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. He was 13, terrified, but driven by a primal will to survive. The Seneca, a society built on logic, military precision, and deep spiritual reverence for the land, did not treat him as a prisoner. They treated him as a child of the wilderness who needed to be forged. The education of a spy. The next 4 years of Simon's life were a masterclass in survival, history, and warfare that no European academy could ever provide. His Seneca adoptive father, an esteemed warrior, taught him to read the forest like a book, to hunt silently, and to speak the fluid, complex Mingo dialect of the Iroquois. More importantly, he taught him strategy. Simon learned that European warfare was rigid, linear, and predictable. Native warfare was fluid, psychological, and devastatingly effective.
He learned the wampum protocols, the sacred art of diplomacy, and the complex web of alliances that linked the powerful Iroquois to the western nations of the Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Wyandot. By the time he was 17, Simon was indistinguishable from his adoptive brethren. His skin was tanned like leather, his movements were precise and economical, and his mind worked seamlessly between the English and native worldviews. He was, in effect, a triple threat: a European who understood the forest, a native-trained warrior who understood European motivations, and a master linguist in a land where miscommunication meant massacre. In 1764, Simon was returned to the colonial world as part of the treaty signed after Bouquet's expedition. The experience was jarring. He no longer felt comfortable in the cramped settlements, where people spoke in shallow, self-serving phrases and walked in loud, clumsy boots. The colony's world seemed small and hypocritical. He returned an asset of unparalleled value. The British immediately recognized his potential. They hired him as an interpreter and scout, a critical bridge between the forts of Pennsylvania and the vast, hostile territory of Indian country.
This is where the astonishing, almost unbelievable double life of Simon Girty began. The shadow of Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt, at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, modern-day Pittsburgh, was the strategic anchor of the western frontier. It was a boiling pot of ambition, treachery, and desperation. As an interpreter, Simon Girty sat at the center of every negotiation, every land deal, and every military strategy meeting. He quickly gained a reputation for two things: impeccable accuracy. He never lied in translation, even when the truth was inconvenient or painful for the British officers. This earned him the respect of both native delegations and skeptical colonial officials. Uncanny insight. He didn't just translate words, he translated intent. He could instantly spot the difference between a genuine peace offer and a tactical deception. But as the colonies teetered toward revolution, Girty found himself torn. He was constantly reminded of the broken promises, the endless encroachment, and the diseases that followed every westward push. He saw the treaties signed in good faith by his adopted family torn up by corrupt land speculators and drunken military officials.
By 1774, he was working for Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, and participating in what became known as Dunmore's War, a conflict fought explicitly to pave the way for Virginian settlement into the Ohio Valley. In the brutal Battle of Point Pleasant, Girty proved his military mettle, guiding Virginia militia forces to victory against a massive Shawnee army led by the legendary Chief Cornstalk. The catalyst, betrayal, and the burning of Kentucky. The breaking point arrived with the American Revolution. When the colonies declared independence, Girty was working at Fort Pitt for the nascent Continental Army. He was offered a commission as an officer, a title, and land, everything an ambitious young frontiersman could want. Yet his loyalty was not to a flag, but to the land and the people who truly respected him. In March 1778, a delegation of Delaware chiefs traveling under a flag of truce to Fort Pitt to discuss peace were arrested and summarily executed by Patriot officers. The reason? A perceived threat of alliance with the British. This was not merely a crime, it was an unforgivable transgression under native law and a violation of every diplomatic oath Girty held sacred. For Simon Girty, the Americans had become the greater threat, not just to the British crown, but to the very concept of honor and the survival of the native nations. He made his choice. On a cold night in April 1778, Simon Girty, along with a few trusted associates, slipped away from Fort Pitt. He did not go to the British in Detroit to collect a salary. He went to the Shawnee Nation. They welcomed him back with open arms, seeing him as a rare commodity, a white man who had seen the European world, rejected it, and returned to stand with them. It was here he received his most infamous title, the White Mingo, or, less charitably in colonial records, the Great Renegade. The War in the West, a man in two worlds. For the next 2 decades, Simon Girty became the most wanted man on the American frontier. The Continental Army placed an enormous bounty on his head. He was painted as a monster, a bloodthirsty fiend, a white savage who commanded the painted legions against innocent settlers. The reality was far more complex and strategically brilliant. Girty's value to the British and the native Confederacy was his ability to synthesize two opposing worlds. Intelligence. He knew the weaknesses, supply lines, and tactical plans of every American officer on the frontier, having trained and worked with many of them. His intelligence reports were credited with saving the British fortress in Detroit multiple times. Military command. He led joint forces of British Rangers and native warriors.
His most famous actions, and the source of his lasting infamy, were the raids into Kentucky. He participated in the planning and execution of nearly every major confrontation in the Ohio Valley, including the siege of Fort Lawrence and the legendary Battle of Blue Licks in 1782, where American forces, including a young Daniel Boone, suffered a crushing, humiliating defeat.
But the most astonishing stories were the countless unrecorded acts of diplomacy and rescue. Girty was often accused of cruelty, but historical records show a different pattern. He frequently used his immense influence to save American captives from torture or execution. Time and again, he paid ransoms out of his own pocket, intervened in village disputes, and smuggled settlers back to colonial lines. He was a man fighting a total war, but with a complex moral code: defend the land, defeat the army, but spare the innocent if possible. He saved the life of his old friend, Colonel William Crawford, only to be overruled by the majority of the Delaware War Council. Crawford's horrific execution was later falsely blamed on Girty, forever sealing his reputation as a villain in the American popular imagination. The Secret Treaty. The end of the Revolution did not end Girty's war. The Americans had won independence from Britain, but they still had to win the West from the native nations. In the 1790s, Girty served as the chief interpreter for the Native Confederacy, a massive, unified alliance of the Shawnee, Miami, and other nations dedicated to holding the Ohio River as a permanent boundary. He was the voice and the mind behind the greatest native military victories in U.S. history.
St. Clair's defeat, 1791. Girty's intelligence and tactical advice contributed to the absolute annihilation of Major General Arthur St. Clair's American Army, the single worst defeat ever inflicted upon the U.S. Army by a Native American force. Over 1,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Girty was there. But the tide eventually turned. After the decisive American victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, 1794, Girty knew the fight was truly over. He retreated to Canada, living out his remaining years on a small, protected farm granted to him by the British Crown. He became a historical ghost, a figure of myth and terror in the States, but a wise, revered elder to the displaced native people and the quiet British officers who knew the full scope of his service. This is where the story you read at the start finds its meaning. The frail old man who died in Ohio in 1827 was not Simon Girty. He was the alias Girty used to slip back into the U.S. years earlier to conduct a final, secret mission of diplomacy and reconnaissance for the British Crown. The actual Simon Girty had died in Canada years before, blind and in pain, his life spent fighting for a land that never truly understood or forgave his divided heart. But that decree from President John Quincy Adams, it wasn't for Girty's widow. It was for the widow of his younger brother, James Girty, who had fought alongside him for decades. The president, a man of cold, hard historical fact, was quietly acknowledging the debt the United States owed to the family of the White Mingo. He knew that for all the bloodshed, Simon Girty's actions, his intimate knowledge of both sides, his impossible position, his constant toggling between war and diplomacy, ultimately prevented the frontier from dissolving into even more total, endless chaos.
Simon Girty was not a simple traitor. He was an American-born legend who chose a people over a nation, a vision of the wilderness over a corrupt civilization, and paid for that choice with his reputation, becoming the necessary villain who helped shape the ultimate borders of the United States. His life story is the true, savage, and astonishing narrative of the founding of the American West,